It took me a while before I started to consider character voice as a part of the writing craft, until one day I realized that all of my characters were sounding the same. They would have the same values, they would have the same turns of phrase, they would interact with the characters the same way. I was basically just transplanting one character from one story to another. It wasn't until I started to play around with point of view that I started to consider how I could shift it, how it could be different. When I first started writing, I started mainly with fan fiction. I really started to go and think about this when I would be writing from the point of view of a character from the series that I was writing about or in the world of. And I realized, well, they wouldn't really think this, they wouldn't say this, because from what I knew of the show, their experiences didn't lead to that. And so I started to consider, well, for my main character, my protagonist that I created to place into that series, they should also go ahead and be different. They should have things they wouldn't say, things they wouldn't do, certain ways that they would say things. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. So first, what even is character voice? You can think of character voice as a filter. Your character has lived a life and they've had experiences in that life. Every single experience they've had, just as with real people, it affects the way they see the world, how they feel about the world, how they interact with the world. It's the character's expression of themselves and how they're interacting with the world at that moment versus the author's expression of the world that they're seeing in their head as they're writing. The best way I found to do this is to create character cheat sheets. Basically, what this sheet is going to do for you, it's going to let you keep track of all of these little nuances that will be specific to your character. Also, before we dive in, I wanted to go and make a note that you don't have to worry about all of this for your first draft. It's fantastic if you've already have it created, but don't stress out over, oh my gosh, did they sound the same? Did I implement this correctly? All of that can be fixed in the revision. You want to go ahead and make this character sheet, and it's okay to do it before you start writing the first draft, but don't get too hung up on it, because most of the magic of writing actually comes in the revision phase. On your character sheet, you're going to have a few things that you want to consider. First, you want to think about how old your character is. This isn't quite the biggest thing to worry about. This is more just a frame of reference for the types of experiences they will have had, how much independence they may have already had. So don't get hung up too much on the number. It's more about how they would see the world. I know there's a lot of people who think that when they write children, in the perspective of children, they have to dumb down a lot of things, almost make them seem kind of stupid or naive. The biggest thing is to think about how they see the world differently than an adult with all these experiences from the past see it. And then also the people around them are going to be very different as well. Another really big thing to consider with your characters is where they grew up. And this can mean a few different things. You can think of it on a broad scale. If they grew up in another country, you're going to want to think about how people in that country speak, how they act, how they see the world. For example, in the United States, we use miles versus kilometers. That's going to be a really big indicator of character voice as well. It'll just be a little tiny thing that will go and instantly be like, oh, okay, so I know a little bit something about this character because of this fact. It can also be, did they grow up in the really rich bougie neighborhood, or did they grow up in the slums or the more impoverished side of town? That's going to affect how they speak, how they talk, the kind of people they're around, the type of situations they're in. Another thing that you can consider about where they grew up: did they grow up in the city? Did they grow up in the wilderness? Did their parents live out in a cabin with nobody else around? Their only friends were like animals. And I touched on this a little bit, but you also want to consider who they've spent their time with. So if you are writing a character that is a child, the people that they will have spent the most time with is probably their parents or their caretakers. So that can go and influence how they see the world. If your character grew up in an impoverished neighborhood or a neighborhood overrun with crime and things like that, they would have been around people that maybe make questionable decisions. This will make them more on their guard and maybe probably more paranoid, cautious, those types of things. Versus if they're around like these high elite socialites all the time who maybe don't always say what they're actually wanting to say, but they always have an angle to play, that's going to influence how they speak, how they interact with the world. Because since they're around people that always have an angle, they're just naturally going to also be thinking ahead. Okay, so this is what this is going to get me. This is what I can benefit from this. Can I benefit from that? What should I say to get this to happen this way? And that will go and change. Those two different characters we've just discussed would be massively different. You also want to consider what your character does for a living. It could be their job. Maybe they're a stay-at-home parent. Maybe they are in high school. That would be what they do all day. So not necessarily even for a living, but what do they do all day? What they do all day is going to carry into their worldview, their relationships, their internal and external voices. And depending on what they do all day, certain things will pop out that might not for another character. For example, if you have a character that's a lawyer, they might be really good at arguing or picking apart other people's decisions and actions. Versus if you have someone that does bookkeeping or accounting all day long, they might go through life looking at objects and be like, oh, okay, so this is what this is going to round up to be for like the whole year. Or they'll really be like crunching numbers in their head all the time. Or if you have a writer, they will be pushed more towards words and how that influences people, how people see the world, those kinds of things, versus if you have a character that's a mathematician, and they'll probably see the world more logistically or analytically than perhaps an artist who would see the world in colors. Another thing you want to think about would be your character's personality type or their traits, which we talked about in the last video. I will link that below or right up in here. I think, yeah, it would be up there. So their personality type. I briefly mentioned the Enneagram, and again, I'm not going to go too far into it until I've done more research, but there are 9 types on the Enneagram, and each type have different values, they have different beliefs, they have different ways of seeing the world, different fears, and this is going to color how they interact. A great example is, I think it's type 7. This personality, they're afraid of missing out on the world. They are very much exuberant, outgoing, versus type 8, they are more focused about who can I trust. I can only trust myself. So they're very guarded and they don't trust easily. They will keep things to themselves more because they're afraid of how others might use what they learn about them. And if you don't want to worry about the Enneagram, you can just look at the personality traits that we wrote down for the last video and just play around with them. For example, a character that is broody with a lot of secrets is going to be very different internally voiced than like a bubbly personality that's super extroverted. You want to use these personalities to give your characters unique quirks to themselves that will help set them apart from the other characters, and you want to make sure it pairs well with their general attitude. So again, the optimist versus like a pessimist, they're going to see the world very differently. Another thing to make sure you think about is those negative traits that we gave your characters. You want to make sure to integrate that into their character voice as well. And for the villain, you're going to want to integrate some of the good personality traits too. And this is because nobody is just fully evil, nobody's just fully good, and this is going to make your characters more real and three-dimensional. If you want some examples, a suspicious character is constantly going to be mistrusting the people around them. They'll maybe suspect people more readily. If your character is selfish, they'll probably always be thinking about how a situation can work out in their favor, how they can get the most out of a situation. They probably won't consider others' feelings too much. That's kind of going into narcissistic land as well, but they're kind of close together. You can consider their sense of humor for their character cheat sheet. So if you have someone that has very dry sense of humor, they're going to be very different from someone who has a dark sense of humor, or someone that has like a dad joke kind of sense of humor. And then for the character cheat sheet, you're going to want to think about the hobbies that this character might have, what their job is. That can play into metaphors and analogies. For example, Lyselle Sambury, in her book Blood Like Magic, she has her main character who is really big into cooking and baking, and she takes that on for her family. And it's a part of the story. She ends up entering like a food competition. She also thinks in terms of how those work together. I know there was a scene that stood out to me. She's grappling with the decision, and she has the metaphor of how, I think she was making bread and how all the ingredients come together, or how she can make a recipe her own versus just doing what someone else did. So she can play off of things that have happened in her past and the traditions of her family, but she can put a twist on it and add her own little zest to it and find her own individuality within that without getting rid of the tradition and the part that was her family. So that came from this character's love of baking, which is amazing. I know Abby Emmons, in her book The Other World, she has a character that grew up on an island, basically secluded from the entire world. She uses a lot of ocean metaphors. She has a very poetic way of thinking, very whimsical, versus one of the other characters who is a bush pilot. He knows about like the sky conditions, and so he thinks in those terms as well. He's very philosophical, and that all feeds together. You also always want to consider the internal conflict that we talked about in this video up here. because that is also going to filter into this character voice. For example, if they believe that the only thing that will bring happiness is money, then they're always going to be looking at the world as a way of, can I make money from this? How is this going to make me money? If they don't make money, they'll be feeling down on themselves. They'll be very critical of themselves. If they see other people who are like rich and famous, they're probably going to be jealous of them and see them as being happier. Another really great tool to separate characters and character voice is to think about the way they phrase things. If you have one character that's always saying like, what the hell? You don't want every single character to talk like that. Otherwise, what makes them unique? How can your readers differentiate them? The goal here is to be able to have lines of dialogue and instantly know which character said that, which character would put that spin on it. And of course, this is different if it's a character that's relaying information, but they still have a little twist on it, probably. You can think of things like in superhero movies. Normally, the superhero or the hero is going to have a catchphrase. Or in Doctor Who, if any of you are Whovians out there, Clara Oswald, she says, "Oh my stars," which I think is a really, really cool phrasing that I hadn't heard before I watched the show, and so it's very unique to her character. You might want to keep some dialogue or vocabulary specific to just one character, ways of phrasing things. You also can implement body language to help differentiate your characters and your character voice. I did this in one of my stories where I had one of my characters, when she was nervous, she would reach behind herself and she would tug on her hair. That was a nervous tick of hers. Maybe their character laughs nervously. Maybe they fidget with their hands a lot. So if you have characters that are doing things like that, let it only be that character that does that. Otherwise, if everyone's doing it, it's not going to be unique. Or I know one of the things in Doctor Who again, like David Tennant's Doctor, the 10th Doctor, he runs his hands through his hair a lot. And that's one of the things that makes him unique, in my opinion, from a lot of the other characters. Now, here are some bonus tips that you can use to help you get into your character voice. One thing to think about, especially if you're swapping point of views in your book, think about how the punctuation can lend itself to your character voice. Think about the function of punctuation. For example, maybe in one point of view, you separate clauses with an em dash, and in another you use the semicolon. Maybe you use parentheses to show like internal thought versus like italics. Maybe you use a lot of ellipses to show that they trail a lot in their thought processes. Don't go crazy. You still want it to be readable and legible, but you can put a little bit of a twist and just think about how that can differentiate your characters as well. Another thing that you can do is to use a different font while you're drafting. Not for the final published product, that you want the same font, but one thing you can do is when you're in one point of view, you can have one font and then have a different font for another point of view. And I would, for another character point of view. And I would recommend both of these being different, or however many of these you have, I would have them be different from the final font that you're going to use. Simply because at the end you do want it all to be the same font. You don't want to have a multiple, unless you can, if you want to play around with formatting. You can do whatever you want, but it'll be a little against the norm and a little more difficult to market. But what happens when you use different fonts for different characters is as soon as you're typing in that font, you're like instantly in the mind space of that character once you do it enough times. And you can even play around with it. So if you have like a really edgy character and their thoughts are on the edgy side all the time, maybe you have like a sharp font. Or like if you're writing from, say, a serial killer's perspective, maybe go use like the kind of font you'd see in a horror movie. If you have someone super bubbly and like excited, maybe you use a bubble font. And then finally, if you want something that you can just try this out with and you're not sure how it is or how you'd even write multiple personalities and different character voices, take two characters, and this can just be for practice. Take two characters and make them polar opposites of each other. You can do the optimist versus the pessimist. You can do grumpy sunshine. And just play around with how they would see the world differently. And this can make it very, very different for you and very obvious to you. Just play around with it and experiment and see what happens. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, as always, comment down below. I will be making a video that is just an example of walking you through this entire process, everything that we've talked about in this video series, which I will link down below. I hope all this is helpful to you. If you have any questions before I make that video, please go ahead and drop them down below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. If you want more content like this, please go ahead and like and subscribe. It really helps me a lot, and it helps me understand what you all are interested in, what I can give you, and what is of value to you. So, yep, let's keep having this conversation. Look forward to the next time. See you then.